Tonight at 10, the voters decide that after 4 decades, it's time for Britain to leave the European Union. As the results were declared, there was jubilation among those who'd campaigned for years to leave the EU. For Nigel Farage, it's the realisation of a lifelong dream. More recent converts struck a slightly different note.
I believe we now have a glorious opportunity. We can pass our laws and set our taxes entirely according to the needs of the UK economy. We can control our own borders in a way that is not discriminatory.
For those who'd fought for the UK to remain in the EU, there was utter dejection and a sense of disbelief. Within hours of the result, an emotional David Cameron emerged from number 10 to announce his resignation.
I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
There was turmoil on the financial markets as sterling plunged and some company shares fell by almost a third. In Scotland, where a clear majority voted to remain, the First Minister declared that independence was back on the cards.
It is therefore a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum must be on the table, and it is on.
And we'll be looking at how 17 million people took the biggest political decision in the UK in half a century.
Coming up, 4 of the top 10 areas for voter turnout were right here in the south. We reflect on the surge for leave. And we're also live with Polish migrants in one of our few towns which voted to remain.
Good evening from Downing Street after a tumultuous day in the history of the United Kingdom. Early this morning came confirmation that voters had decided that Britain should leave the European Union, ending a relationship which began 43 years ago. A few hours later, David Cameron appeared here outside number 10 to announce his resignation, which will take effect by October. The result, by the way, was clear. 52% voting to leave, 48% voting to remain. Turnout was high at just over 72%. The vote now sets the UK on a very different path, raising many fundamental questions about the way ahead. Our first report tonight is from our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. It does contain some flash photography.
A gamble too far. David Cameron, a lucky politician whose luck just ran out. A vote he offered on our place in the world. A vote he lost.
I was absolutely clear about my belief that Britain is stronger, safer and better off inside the European Union. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
A defeat so big, the consequences so complex, the Prime Minister, and maybe his family too, have had enough.
I've said before that Britain can survive outside the European Union, and indeed that we could find a way. Now the decision has been made to leave, we need to find the best way. And I will do everything I can to help. I love this country, and I feel honoured to have served it. And I will do everything I can in future to help this great country succeed. Thank you very much.
But as that door closes, what lies next? Chaos or opportunity? Boris Johnson, whose decision to push the Out campaign gave it pulling power that might have made the difference.
Shame on you, Boris! You're parasite, Boris Johnson!
Walked into hostility, not a victory parade as he left home this morning. The winning side, a campaign office. not a Whitehall address. But maybe 2 wannabe prime ministers. Michael Gove and Boris Johnson eager to praise their friend and rival, David Cameron, and soberly mark the scale of the decision to leave the EU.
And to those who may be anxious, whether at home or abroad, this does not mean that the United Kingdom will be in any way less united, nor indeed does it mean that it will be any less European. And I want to speak to the millions of people, directly to the millions of people who did not vote for this outcome, especially young people, who may feel that this decision in some way involves pulling up a drawbridge or any kind of isolationism, because I think the very opposite is true.
As we move forward, we should be in no doubt that Britain is embarking on a new chapter, but one that is in line with our best traditions. Now we have a new chance to extend that openness even further. We can build a new, stronger and more positive relationship with our European neighbours based on free trade and friendly cooperation.
It was nearly 5 before the result was final.
The British people have spoken and the answer is we're out.
But an early push for out in Sunderland had given a taste of victory to come. Across the north of England, in market and coastal towns, votes to leave piled up and up. Wales chose out too. Only sad faces for Remain held London, Scotland and Northern Ireland. From tears to cheers they'd been waiting so long to raise. Nigel Farage, the first party leader to emerge, up and early.
It's a victory for ordinary people, decent people. It's a victory against the big merchant banks, against the big businesses and against big politics. And I'm proud of everybody that had the courage, in the face of all the threats, everything they were told, they had the guts to stand up and do the right thing.
Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the opposition.
But as the Prime Minister said he was off, doubts spread about Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr Corbyn, what's your reaction to the Prime Minister resigning?
Awkward, he now faces a vote of confidence. The unions back him, but many MPs believe he hung back rather than campaign hard.
I campaigned the length and breadth of this country on a party position which was that we should support remaining in Europe, recognising the many deficiencies of the European Union in order to reform it. I made the points about working conditions, I made the points about jobs, I made the points about environmental protection.
But Remain smiles in Scotland could lead to another split. As they warned, with England choosing out and Scotland voting in, the SNP is calling for another vote on Scottish independence.
It is a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum must be on the table, and it is on the table.
People are coming to Westminster to witness this day, perhaps to make sense of what's really going on. In the last 24 hours, we've decided to leave the European Union, an institution that's been part of the fabric of our country since the 1970s. As a result, the Prime Minister has resigned. There'll be someone else in charge in number 10 from the autumn, and some of Labour's MPs are trying to force their leader, Jeremy Corbyn, to walk away too. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has said there must be a second referendum on the other union, the one between Scotland and the rest of the UK. It's not so much that this result has turned politics upside down, but it's shattered its established conventions.
This flag will become a British souvenir. This one, the common standard. But our decision might trigger so much change, we may watch for years before the banner is final. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, some of the areas which recorded the biggest votes for leave were traditional Labour heartlands in Wales, in the Midlands and in the north of England. And while some people have been sharply criticising David Cameron for calling this referendum in the first place, there's also been criticism of Labour from some Remain people for failing to generate more support for the EU in those traditional Labour areas. Our correspondent Jeremy Cook has been speaking to voters in County Durham.
County Durham, mining heritage. Labour strongholds, now determined to leave Europe.
Do you mind me asking how you voted?
Come out.
Around here, disillusionment with politics is palpable. And down the Chippy, it's hard to find anyone who voted to remain.
I think it's a class divide, to be honest. You find it? I think it is, yeah. Definitely.
That they forget about us up here as well. I really do. I think they should maybe bring the government up to the middle of the country. Let us all have a say, because we all getting really sick of the way things are.
I work on this hand, so I could have been persuaded both ways, obviously, with them possibly leaving if we leave. But to me, I think the best option was obviously just to leave and look after ourselves pretty much.
No regrets today?
No regrets, no regrets.
This is a rejection of mainstream politics, including the Labour Party.
I've never seen any Labour people in here, to be honest. UKIP man comes in.
A momentous day, but on the factory floor, it's business as usual. They're making water coolers and export to the EU. But again, most here back leave, from the workers to the boss.
History will prove we made the right decision. I think in 2 years' time we'll say, thank God we got out.
I think people have just become disillusioned. They really have. All the money's ploughed in down south. Any businesses, anything like that, just seems to be in the south of England, and they take care of themselves and they just leave us out in the wilderness.
I used to always vote Labour, but I haven't been recently because it's an open house policy. This country's sinking because there's too many people coming in.
We need these workers to make our factories functional.
We'll always keep a lot of the foreign workers, but it's going to be more controlled.
Moving the standings!
In the city, it's easier to catch up with some of the 42.5% in County Durham who voted Remain. Here, there's disappointment.
I think it kind of shows that the older generation who mainly voted leave, but most of the younger generation voted stay. And I think it just kind of shows that there's a real difference, and our future's kind of been taken away.
I think the north of England generally is taking the opportunity to get back politically at Cameron because of all the austerity.
But the Labour strongholds here weren't taking much notice of their own leadership.
No, absolutely,
either.
yeah.
Why not?
Well, you're better off asking Jeremy Corbyn. I think it's a lot of reasons.
The message flowing from here is the same across the heartlands of England and Wales. They voted, above all, for change, and change will come and shape the political landscape of a nation. Jeremy Cook, BBC News, Durham.
So Mr Cameron emerged from number 10 at just after 8 o'clock this morning to announce that he was stepping down as Prime Minister, and it is just 13 months since he was re-elected, securing the first Conservative majority in 2 decades. And whoever replaces him faces the challenge of trying to unite the Conservative Party, which is still sharply divided over Europe. Our Deputy Political Editor John Pienaar has this report on Mr Cameron's resignation and considers his legacy and who might replace him.
What's happening in Downing Street? David Cameron's just resigned. An emotional moment? Well, the crowd, or at least those who wanted out of the EU, didn't mind a bit.
Where's Boris?
He'll be on his way. There's a removal van waiting at the back of there, actually. Just needs to get that taken out.
Get all this cleared away so he can go straight in. Get the big man in, little man out.
For the Camerons, it had ended in tears. Premierships often do. He'd taken his last and greatest gamble and lost, and his obvious pain was shared by colleagues who'd been by his side in his last battle.
This is a true body blow, because he led from the front, and he comes out, and he's shown as ever this beautiful composure, this remarkable leadership, this great courage to admit, look, I put my neck on the line and here we are.
David Cameron also fought alongside his predecessor, who felt he was made of the right stuff.
Sir John, first of all, just briefly, your reflection on the premiership of David Cameron. How will he be remembered?
He was a one-nation Conservative. He looks for a tolerant, inclusive, undivided nation. And I don't think it's the fault is at his door that our nation at this moment, upon this issue, is more fractured than we have seen it for a very long time.
David Cameron didn't have the hardest upbringing. At Oxford, he mixed with fellow Old Etonians and others equally privileged in the famously high-living Bullingdon Club. As Tory leader, he promised something new and fresh, like not losing again.
Nothing and no one will stop us.
He detoxified the Tory brand, greener, driven by compassion, and in the Arctic by huskies. In office, along with the Liberal Democrats, he led the first coalition since the war. He won a referendum in Scotland, and with a promise of a new deal in Europe, took a risk too far.
We will give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice.
David Cameron's no thrill seeker. He took gamble after gamble because he felt he had to hold power or under enormous pressure in Scotland or from his own side over Europe. In the end, he lost everything, and Scottish independence is up for grabs again. His dream of leading a socially liberal one-nation Tory party has died. His place in history is spoiled, his crown passed on prematurely. But to who? Boris Johnson's early favourite, popular, though not now with everyone. Theresa May's hopes are no secret, and Michael Gove denies any ambition. Others fancy the job, whatever they say now.
I hope very much we do have a woman in the final two. I think that's important in 21st century Britain. Whether it's me, whether it's one of my other brilliant female colleagues, that's going to be for the party to decide.
Well, I'm not going to make any decision about that until we've had a bit of a rest over the weekend. We've had a chance to talk to our colleagues, and obviously I wouldn't rule anything out.
Off to the palace today, part of a PM's routine. They miss it when they leave. And though David Cameron always said he could see a life after the premiership, he's lost something he loved, and the hurt was plain to see. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
With me in Downing Street, our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. And despite all the appeals from Downing Street, the starkest warnings throughout this campaign, the voters weren't having any of it.
They weren't. And in the end, as one cabinet minister said in the early hours of this morning, they don't believe us. Despite all the clamour of the campaign, all those very doom-laden warnings to the public, in the end, not by a huge surge, but by a decisive margin and a narrow result, voters rejected that. They said something else. And I think that in 24 hours, the Prime Minister gone, the Labour leader under pressure, the consequences of this decision that's been made in one day, only just beginning to really unfold. This is one of these moments that we'll look back on as being so significant, because a referendum, that black and white vote that is binding, that is a very clear-cut decision, is something that can have the kind of consequences that we're only really just beginning to understand. You know, the numbers of the result in themselves were not surprising. The polls seemed tight. We knew it was going to be close. In the end, the margin was not very significant. But the consequences of it are unknown. And, you know, it's almost as if voters were willing in the end to take the gamble they were warned about again and again, because they thought, you know what, it might be worth it. And we're not really up for listening to those warnings. And the Prime Minister, who began promising this referendum really to try to settle a row inside the Tory party family, has ended up paying with that, not just with his job, but probably also with the legacy that he cared a lot about.
We'll explore some of the consequences a little later, Laura. Thanks very much for now. Laura Kuenssberg there. Well, the referendum result did cause some serious turbulence in the financial markets. The pound saw its biggest ever one-day fall before rallying. The FTSE 100 share index plummeted at one point by 8% before the Bank of England said it was ready with some £250 billion of extra funding. And US stocks saw their biggest single day loss in nearly 5 years. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, tracked the market's reaction throughout the day. There is some flash photography in his report.
After complacency, shock. After a quiet start, red ink covered the screens. The markets reacted with one quick word when Britain voted to leave the EU: sell. Anything that is risky. The pound fell, bank stocks fell, only tension rose. The governor of the Bank of England went public, trying to bring some semblance of calm to torrid markets.
We are well prepared for this. Her Majesty's Treasury and the Bank of England have engaged in extensive contingency planning, and the Chancellor and I have remained in close contact, including through the night and this morning.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day.
It was a day reminiscent of financial crises of old, Black Wednesday of 1992, when Britain crashed out of the forerunner of the single currency. This time the pound fell further, with one investor predicting a possible recession.
There's been huge volatility in the foreign exchange markets, with sterling down over 10% at one stage, and stock prices have fallen pretty much everywhere. Particularly, I have to say, in the banks, where we've seen stock prices fall over 20%. That's a very unusual occurrence.
There were plenty of predictions of economic chaos if Britain voted to leave the European Union. Well, some of those predictions will now be tested. Today has seen falling stock markets, a falling pound. Sometimes it can all seem a little distant from everyday life, but the effects can be very real. Take holidays. They could become more expensive as the pound weakens, but a weaker sterling could be a boost for exports. House prices could fall. Good news for first-time buyers. And there was no move on historically low interest rates, and probably won't be for a while. Ryanair, a prominent supporter of staying in the EU. But with Brexit ahead, the tune has now changed.
We won't be able to make new investments in the UK. We're now going to have probably a 2-year period of great uncertainty, and what businesses want is certainty, and we will look at making our investments and we'll have a greater degree of certainty in economies like Germany, Italy, Ireland, Spain.
A sunset or a sunrise. For some business leaders, it was time to focus on the positive.
We have a choice to make. Do we want to have a positive vision for the future, or is it going to be all negative? If we go down the negative route, then we'll have failure. If we go down the positive route, we have a great opportunity.
It was a long night in the city. The test now is for the UK economy. Can it flourish in a new world outside the European Union? Kamal Ahmed, BBC News.
With me here in Downing Street now is our business editor, Simon Jack, and there'll be lots of viewers wondering, Simon, I'm sure, when are they going to start experiencing some of the effects or consequences of this decision?
Yeah, it was politically dramatic, it was financially traumatic this morning, and people will be wondering, checking themselves for bruises, how's it going to affect me? We'll see some differences almost immediately. The pound in your pocket, for example, might not go as far. At the petrol station, we might see petrol go up by a couple of pence. As Kamal was saying, holidays might get more expensive. But on Monday morning, life will go on. But make no mistake, big changes are on their way. We heard that companies might begin to start thinking, am I going to invest as much? We've heard from Airbus, employs 15,000 people here in the UK. They're saying, we'll review our investment strategy. Some big investment banks here from America who can sell to the EU from London, they're saying, will we have the same number of people? But these things will take days, months, even years to unpick. So what I would say is, on Monday morning, do nothing, but it doesn't mean that nothing is happening. This really is a very, very significant moment in the economic life of this country.
Simon, again, thanks very much. Simon Jack, therefore, is our business editor. Now, in Scotland, where a big majority voted to stay in the EU, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said that she intended to take all possible steps to keep Scotland in the European Union. She said a second Scottish independence referendum was now highly likely and that it could take place within 2 years. Our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, reports on the reaction in Scotland and its implications for the future of the UK.
Migrants are welcome here!
Migrants welcome, maybe, but the referendum result is roundly rejected by protesters angry about being dragged out of the EU against their will. They believe if Scotland was independent, they wouldn't have to leave. And Nicola Sturgeon says another referendum is on the table.
Scotland faces the prospect of being taken out of the EU against our will. I regard that as democratically unacceptable. We said clearly that we do not want to leave the European Union. I am determined that we will do what it takes to make sure that these aspirations are realised.
Are you confident that in the potential turmoil that could follow a Brexit, that those are circumstances in which Scotland will want to vote for independence?
It is exactly because of the uncertainty and the potential turmoil that we face that I think it is in my responsibility to seek the stability and the certainty that membership of the European Union gives us.
So Nicola Sturgeon did not say that she will definitely hold another referendum on Scottish independence, but she did say she thinks it is highly likely. She believes this Brexit will make Scots more likely to support independence, but she's not going to set the date until she's sure. She knows she can't afford to lose another referendum. Don't assume independence is now inevitable, says the Scottish Tory leader.
The 1.6 million votes cast in this referendum in favour of Remain do not wipe away the 2 million votes that we cast less than 2 years ago. And we do not address the challenges of leaving the European Union by leaving our own Union of Nations, our biggest market and our closest friends.
Voters remember being told less than 2 years ago that to stay in the EU, they had to vote to stay in the UK. So many are now starting to think again.
I voted to stay the last time. I really do believe in the United Kingdom, but I suspect this time around we will vote to leave.
I don't know, I personally wouldn't, but I know a lot of people that have already changed their minds completely.
And minds may change yet again if Scots are asked to go to the polls once more. If there is another referendum, the SNP have not decided that yet. They'll wait and see if voter frustration at the EU result really does translate into increased support for independence. But if they do choose to hold another vote, senior sources have told me tonight they will go for it pretty quickly. They want to try and get the whole thing done inside of 2 years before the UK actually leaves the EU.
Sarah, thanks very much again. Sarah Smith, our Scotland editor in Edinburgh. Let's have more reaction then, because we're going to be talking to Northern Ireland, where they voted to stay, and in Wales, where they voted to leave. We'll be talking to Sian Lloyd in Cardiff in a moment. First, let's join Chris Buckler, who's in Newry in County Down.
Well, as you mentioned, Hugh, Northern Ireland, like Scotland, voted to remain inside the EU, but it is the verdict of the wider UK that matters. And as a result, people are starting to consider the consequences for places like here in Newry, that sits so close to the Irish border and which has been a centre of cross-border trade. Could it mean, as some have suggested during the referendum campaign, that customs checkpoints could return to that border? That has not been answered today. However, Northern Ireland's First Minister, who campaigned for a leave vote, has appealed to people not to panic. She says that there could be opportunities for the economy in this. And Irish Republicans, they clearly believe that there are opportunities. With that push for a second independence referendum in Scotland, they're now calling for what's known as a border poll, basically a referendum on whether there should be a united Ireland. Now, it's highly unlikely that that's going to happen anytime soon, but there has been one consequence of this referendum already. As a result of the Good Friday Agreement, people in Northern Ireland are entitled to hold both an Irish and a British passport. Well, today there has been a rush to get forms to apply for Irish passports in not just nationalist areas, but also in unionist areas. And that's because an Irish passport will remain a European Union passport.
Wales voted to leave the EU. 17 of the 22 local authority areas here wanted to go, and they included Labour strongholds, some of the poorest parts of the country that had a lion's share of billions of pounds of structural funds over the past 16 years. Wales had been a net beneficiary of EU funding. However, the economic arguments that were put forward did not convince people here to stay. British-wide issues of immigration, sovereignty and national security were important to Welsh voters too. However, there will now be a scramble as regards funding. Wales's First Minister Carwyn Jones has called for the Barnett formula, the way in which the budget that Wales gets from Westminster is calculated, to be reconsidered as a matter of urgency to make up for the shortfall.
Sian Lloyd in Cardiff, thank you, and Chris Buckler in Newry, thank you too. So the result was relatively close. The turnout certainly was high, and the regional and national variations were stark. Our correspondent Christian Fraser has been taking a closer look at the breakdown of the votes.
OK, let's take an in-depth look at some of these final numbers. So this is the result: 51.9% for Leave, 48.1% Remain. The total number of eligible voters was 46.5 million. The turnout, 72%, and that is the biggest turnout in a national vote since 1992. Now, they thought a bigger turnout would be good news for Remain, but not in England. The margin of victory, 6 points, 53% Leave, 46% Remain. Different story, of course, in Scotland. All 32 counts going for Remain. Slightly lower turnout, but no question over the result. Overwhelmingly pro-Remain. And in Edinburgh, incidentally, it was 74% in favour. Another different story in Wales. A big turnout, but only 5 of the 22 voting areas going for Remain. And rounded up, that's almost the same result as in England. Cardiff was Remain, but Swansea was Leave. And in Northern Ireland, down there at the bottom, again, lower than average turnout, but a sizable vote for Remain, especially in the areas along the border. 3 out of 4 areas in Belfast were for Remain. So the pollsters, the city, the bookies, they all got it wrong because they didn't understand what was going on north of London. Look at this area here, all blue in the rural parts of England, into the north and northwest, the key Labour supporting areas. This is the Labour areas of Blackburn, Rosendale and Burnley, all of them going out. Boston in Lincolnshire, the highest vote for Leave in the country. Not a Labour seat, but a Tory one this time. And according to the 2011 census, home to the highest proportion of Eastern European migrants anywhere in England and Wales. And down here, Great Yarmouth, a town with a UKIP mayor. Again, one of the top 5 Leave votes in the country. Over 70% wanted out. So we've shown you there then the nationwide split between England and Scotland. What about the generational divide? Well, it's far too early to give you a definitive take, but this is what one poll conducted yesterday says. It suggests 27% of 18 to 25-year-olds wanted to leave, compared to 73% wanting to stay in Europe. But as voters get older, that starts to swing the other way. For people over 65, research suggests that 40% wanted to stay in the EU and 60% wanted to leave.
Christian Fraser there with a closer look at some of those voting figures and percentages. And by the way, if you'd like more information on how people voted in your area, well, you can find all the details on our website, bbc.co.uk/news. Have a look at the website, and the links are there for you. You can find your area and you'll see the breakdown there on the page. Now, Chancellor Merkel of Germany expressed great regret today at Britain's decision to leave the EU. She's due to meet President Hollande of France for urgent talks on Monday, ahead of a summit on Tuesday. But some of Europe's politicians have been calling for their own referendums in the light of the UK result. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, is in Brussels tonight with the latest.
Well, Hugh, there was a sharp intake of breath across Europe today as it began to sink in. This really had happened. The UK is leaving. Of course, the leaders of Europe's increasingly influential Eurosceptic parties rushed to cheer the results, but the governments of Europe are very worried. And here in Brussels, the mood is despondent and resentful. Meanwhile, passionate Europeans are now dubbing our referendum day Black Thursday as they react to the news.
Le Brexit qui se dessine ce matin.
The day a British decision delivered an almighty blow across a continent. Europe's media and its leaders were stunned.
Großbritannien wird die Europäische Union verlassen.
Even the normally impassive ones.
Es gibt nichts drum herum zu reden.
Let's not beat around the bush. Today marks a turning point for Europe and the project of European unity.
They were scared too.
Le danger est immense.
The French president, facing tough elections next year, warned of what he called immense dangers of extremism and populism. His pressing concern, a popular rival who calls for France to have its own in-out EU referendum. Brexit for her was a political present. Her delight today, obvious.
Nous vivons un moment historique.
This is a historic moment. What nobody had foreseen just a few months ago is now a reality for all. Yes, it is possible to leave the European Union.
And out, say Europe's leaders, is out. They want to start the Brexit process now, not in October, as David Cameron suggests. Frustration then for the Brussels bigwigs at Cameron, at Brexit, and at the question of this British journalist. Is this the beginning of the end of the European Union?
No.
Thank you all. No, said the President of the European Commission, and marched out. His refusal to properly answer my question is indicative, you could say, of the aloof Brussels attitude critics so dislike. Talk in Europe is now swiftly moving from Brexit to possible Frexit, France, Swexit, Sweden and more. In all the years that I've been watching European politics, I have never seen this continent more Eurosceptic, the future of the European Union more uncertain. Katya Adler, BBC News, Brussels.
So the complex process of uncoupling the UK from the European Union is expected to dominate relations with Brussels for years to come. But as Katja was saying, the UK's formal membership could end as soon as 2018. So what does the likely timetable look like in the days and months and years ahead? Our chief correspondent Gavin Hewitt considers all the options.
No country has left the EU. Now, after 43 years, the UK is leaving. For the time being, EU laws will still apply. But what is the process of withdrawing? The formal way of departing from the EU is set out in Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. Once an application has been made, it has to be completed within 2 years. That period can be extended, but only if all 27 EU countries agree. This timetable would eventually affect everything from trade to investment. But many Conservatives who backed leave prefer a different route. They want to start with informal talks, testing the ground before the clock starts ticking.
I think the chances of them getting that are very, very slim indeed. Why? There's no incentive for the other states to do that. They will say, you've agreed to this process, why should we make it longer? Some of them have already said that it's Article 50 or nothing else.
The timetable may not be entirely in Britain's hands. There are some in Europe who would like to see the departure process begin straight away in order to lessen the uncertainty surrounding the European project. And what about trade, about continuing access to the EU's single market? During the campaign, few details emerged about the trade deal the government would be seeking. Some in the Leave campaign said they would prefer to exit the single market and to strike a UK-EU free trade agreement. But former European Commissioner Peter Mandelson says striking deals will be far from easy.
They bent over backwards during the Prime Minister's renegotiation to make it easier for us to stay. They're now going to say, OK, you've made your decision, you've taken your choice, the caravan has got to move on, we've got to sort this out.
A priority for some in the Leave campaign would be to repeal the act that establishes the supremacy of EU law. But determining which EU laws to keep will be an immense task, possibly lasting years. Prominent Leave campaigners were emphasising today there was no rush to trigger the withdrawal process. But EU leaders may take a very different view. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News.
Well, in the USA, President Obama said he respected the referendum result and insisted that the relationship between the US and the UK would endure. The presumptive Republican presidential candidate, Donald Trump, was in Ayrshire today and said it was a great thing that the British people had, in his words, taken back their country. Our North America editor, John Sopel, sent this report.
A quiet entrance isn't Donald Trump's style, and there was even more swagger about the man today. In golf, timing is everything, politics too. And his arrival in Scotland to open a newly refurbished Turnberry was just spot on. The political revolution he's threatening in the US had come overnight to the UK, and he couldn't hide his delight.
I think it'll be a good thing. You're taking your country back. You're going to let people that you want into your country, and people that you don't want, or people that you don't think are going to be appropriate for your country or good for your country, you're not going to have to take. And, look, Europe, like the United States, has made tremendous mistakes over the last period of time.
Would you support the breakup of the European Union? Because that seems to be what would happen.
Well, it looks like it's on its way, and we'll see what happens.
A different golf course 2 months earlier, and Barack Obama had come to London to lend David Cameron a helping hand in the Brexit debate. He couldn't have been more emphatic or blunt.
That's not going to happen anytime soon, and UK is going to be in the back of the queue.
But that forcefulness grated on many Britons, and the most powerful man in the world may have overplayed his hand. Certainly it was a different tone from the US president today.
I do think that yesterday's vote speaks to the ongoing changes and challenges that are raised by globalization. But while the UK's relationship with the EU will change, one thing that will not change is the special relationship that exists between our two nations. That will endure. The EU will remain one of our indispensable partners.
America is 3,000 miles in that direction, but today it feels a lot closer. The forces that have propelled Britain towards leaving the EU are the same ones that have resulted in Donald Trump gaining the Republican nomination and possibly the presidency come November. John Sopel, BBC News, Turnberry on the Ayrshire coast.
Well, the result, as we've heard, confounded the pollsters and came after a 9-week campaign characterised by some very bitter debate between political allies as well as opponents. The Leave campaign focused squarely in the final days on urging voters, as we've heard, to take back control, while Remain insisted that Britain was stronger, safer and better off in the EU. Our correspondent James Landale reports on how the campaign was won and lost.
So how did they do it? How did the Leave campaign defy expectations and win so many votes in so many areas?
We are better off, we are stronger, we are safer inside.
The start of the campaign was dominated by pro-Remain politicians warning about the economic risks of Brexit. But voters didn't trust the experts or the celebrities, and by the end it was Leave's slogan that you couldn't escape.
Vote Leave and to take back control.
Take back control.
Take back control.
Is it not time we took back control?
At the same time, people heard Leave's warnings about the impact of immigration on public services and its fears about what it saw as the threat of Turkey joining the EU.
The Leave campaign was very disciplined in getting its messages out on money and on migration and on accession, especially of Turkey. Secondly, I think it had an optimistic note. It was much more hopeful about what you will get if you are willing to leave.
And if we vote Leave and take back control, I believe that this Thursday can be our country's Independence Day.
And in Boris Johnson, Leave were blessed with a popular figurehead who, with Michael Gove, brought political showbiz and intellectual credibility to a campaign that reached out to swing voters. And while there were some tensions with Nigel Farage, the UKIP leader ran his own campaign and appealed beyond his core support to traditional Labour voters, many of whom sensed Jeremy Corbyn's equivocation about supporting Remain.
Leave won the referendum because they successfully mobilised a particular section of British society, economically disadvantaged, mainly white, older English voters who live outside of London but do not feel as though they've been winning from globalisation, from European integration, and who wanted to send a very strong message on identity concerns like immigration.
A group of people who are not regular voters, but whom Leave deliberately targeted. This campaign wasn't just about Boris and borders. It was won by the Leave campaign because they tapped into a wider sense of anti-establishment feeling, and that won them the support of voters who feel left behind by globalisation and often ignored by mainstream politics. James Landale, BBC News in central London.
Well, as we've been hearing, the referendum results painted a stark picture of a divided country, with Northern Ireland and Scotland, as we've been reporting, voting strongly to remain against Welsh and English support for leaving the EU. Of the 9 English regions, only London voted to stay, and the results reflected social and generational divides, as our home editor, Mark Easton, explains now.
Peterborough has Anglo-Saxon roots, a cathedral city on the edge of England's fenlands that voted decisively to leave the European Union.
Since the enlargement of the EU in 2004, this city has seen the arrival of some 15,000 Eastern and Central European migrants, helping fuel an economic boom in the city, but also putting pressure on public services and, perhaps most fundamentally of all, changing the character of this ancient English settlement.
Hooray, hooray, we're out today.
People here are excited about Brexit, optimistic that leaving the EU means a better Britain with more homes.
I might be able to get accommodation that's been given to a refugee.
More opportunity.
English people will be able to get more jobs.
More control.
We want our own borders back, and we can make our own laws.
And a better life.
Now should be a bank holiday, Independence Day.
On Peterborough's Lincoln Road, where the EU arrivals have set up businesses and put down roots, one quickly gets a sense of the resentment that immigration has spawned.
This might help explain why Peterborough voted leave. A traditional English baker's shop closed after 136 years. And why? Well, people tend to blame something that's happened 2 doors down. A shiny new Polish delicatessen.
The 3 generations that ran this shop, that traded for over 100 years, I think it's gone too far. I think the country's gone too far. I think the country will never be the same again. But we can only hope that we could put a stop to that and perhaps rebuild it a little bit better.
Just 40 miles south, a city of similar size with a very different view of Brexit. Cambridge voted by almost 3-1 in favour of Remain. Its economy is international, its population thinks globally.
At the city station, there's a multi-storey bicycle park. This is a young, energetic, highly educated place that sees Europe not as a threat, but an opportunity. And today, for many, is a dark day.
I feel really ashamed of my country at the moment. So,
really?
Yeah, it's really sad.
It's incredibly depressing. The world fragmenting is not a world I want to live in.
I'm the founder of a company in this area that's attracted over $100 million of investment and employs 70 people in Cambridge and people worldwide. And we'll be seriously thinking about moving on from now.
I don't know what to say, just need to see what's going to happen.
So do you feel very nervous about it now as somebody from Italy?
I think I still need to realise what happened.
Britain finds itself deeply divided. Optimism and pessimism swirl like countercurrents in the same stream. Successful navigation will require cool heads and skilled hands. Mark Easton, BBC News, Cambridge.
Well, membership of the European Union and before it, the European Economic Community has, of course, been a central focus of Britain's foreign policy for over 40 years. So leaving will mark a fundamental shift, no doubt about it, in Britain's place in the world and in its relations with other countries. Our correspondent James Robbins has been looking back at Britain's EU experience and the impact of today's result.
The entire course of Britain's post-imperial history has just been turned on its head.
To represent the Queen in the celebrations marking the transformation of the century-old Gold Coast colony.
60 years ago, the age of empire was coming to an end. Colonies started getting independence, and Britain struggled to find a role. It was a new alliance with our European neighbours which beckoned.
Officially, we became members at midnight local time.
In 1973, Britain finally joined the common market.
Is Europe stronger with Britain a member? Yes!
40 years on, the leading historian of post-war Britain says it's impossible to exaggerate the magnitude of this referendum's effects.
Never in our peacetime history have so many dials been reset as a result of a single day's events. The only thing comparable in my lifetime, and I was born just after the war, is the getting rid of the British Empire. But this is sudden. This is guillotine time. This is quite extraordinary, and in peacetime, quite unprecedented.
Once upon a time, Britain seemed enthusiastic about staying in Europe. This was Margaret Thatcher campaigning in the 1975 referendum. But as Prime Minister in the 80s, she became increasingly hostile. Both feeding and feeding off popular headlines which helped drive a growing sense Britain was surrendering too much sovereignty.
No! No! No!
Fast forward to this century, and British opposition to the entire project grew. A combination of migration, global economic crisis, plus the Eurozone's travails tipped British public opinion to this outright rejection of the European Union. So will Britain find a new role, and can it remain America's first friend after quitting Europe's top table?
Where would you like us?
That is the danger, that Britain seems like Little Britain, if you like, that it won't be speaking for a whole bloc, it won't be speaking for anything more than itself. It will still obviously be available as an ally for the United States with all the kind of military support and intelligence support that it has, but whether it counts as much symbolically, which has been part of the value to Washington, that is what's in doubt now.
For 50 years, Britain's prime ministers have come and gone, courting Europe, joining Europe, by turns infuriated and sometimes enthused, until David Cameron bet his job on it and lost. Britain has chosen another, quite different path. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, James there mentioned headlines that have featured in terms of European coverage in the papers over the years. Let's just show you a few of tomorrow morning's headlines because they contrast, to say the least. Here's the Daily Mail. It was the day, says the Mail, that the quiet people of Britain rose up against an arrogant, out-of-touch political class. Rather different tone on the Daily Mirror. If we look at the Mirror front page for tomorrow. So what happens now, says the Daily Mirror. There it is, with the image there of rather emotional David Cameron and Samantha Cameron, but the note of uncertainty about what happens next. And then a very different sense. Let's have a look at Libération, which is one of the French dailies. This is the left-of-centre French daily. Very rare to see a big English phrase on the front page there. Good luck with that famous image of Boris Johnson back in 2012 when the Olympics were on and he was London Mayor. So three very different sets of headlines for you there. Lots more, of course. Laura's with me again here in Downing Street, but let's join Katya Adler first, our Europe editor. And just a sense from you, Katya, of the kind of approach now that the UK can expect from the other European states in these negotiations.
Well, of course, Hugh, the Leave vote in the UK sends a message that the EU is crumbling. So for EU leaders now, the priority is damage control. And one way to do that is to show that out hurts. It's not worth it. They want to put others off leaving. Of course, the UK will probably get a decent trade deal in the end, but nobody here wants to make it easy. Tonight, the European Commission President said this will not be an amicable divorce. And certainly France is keen to make an example, if you like, of the UK. And don't forget that Paris is now all that much more powerful inside the EU now that the UK has decided to walk out. But even here, there are EU splits. Central and Eastern Europe, they don't want to alienate the UK. They depend on Britain to maintain tough sanctions against Russia. And Angela Merkel's Germany, well, she's somewhere in between, a passionate European. She doesn't want others to leave, but as a pragmatist, especially when it comes to German trade, she'll work with the UK eventually.
Katya, thanks very much. And to you, Laura, you mentioned it earlier, but let's just underline it now here, which is that we are only just beginning probably to realise the scale and the import of the change that's ahead.
Absolutely. This is the end of part one and the beginning of part however many, and on Wednesday night we were saying how rare it is as individuals and as a country we get the chance to make a political decision that permanently changes the course of our country and potentially of a whole continent. We had the chance to do that, and you know what, for better or for worse, the country made that decision. The consequences could be so enormous for Scotland, for those divisions between town and country, for the whole sense of who we are as a nation. And probably tomorrow morning, next week, next month, we'll all wake up and feel that maybe not very much has changed. But things do change in politics. They never stay the same forever, however much the settlement feels like it's sort of baked into the nature of a country. It's probably only once or maybe twice in all of our lifetimes that such a big decision is taken that really has the potential to transform a country and its relationship with the rest of the world. But you know what? I think we're just beginning to understand, we're just beginning to taste that this is indeed one of those really big, significant junctions.
Laura, again, thanks very much. Laura Kuenssberg there for us. Final word as our political editor tonight. That's all from Downing Street tonight after a day of truly momentous change for the UK and for the EU. The voters have set a new course for Britain, breaking a 43-year bond with the European Union, the biggest political change of the past half-century. We'll leave you tonight with some of the enduring words and images of the day. Have a good night.
The decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
I've got my country back. What I've got, I want to keep.
I feel like someone's kicked me in the stomach. I mean, Europe's not perfect, but we're much better trying to influence it from within than without.
17 million people have said we must leave the European Union. We now need a Brexit government.
The British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
This does not mean that the United Kingdom will be in any way
less united, nor indeed does it mean that it will be any less European.
It's an open house policy. This country's sinking because there's too many people coming in.
I think people have just become disillusioned. They really have.
I thought we would have stayed in. So yeah, very disappointed with the outcome.
This morning when I woke up, I actually did suddenly think, oh God, like, I actually wish we'd stayed in.
I'm just glad we're out in it and that's it for me, because this is our England. This is our England.